The Roca London Gallery is designed by Zaha Hadid Architects, and as you know, Zaha Hadid is one of the most prominent female architects in the world. I wouldn't say that that's a reason to celebrate International Women's Day. I think you should celebrate the day wherever you are, but I think you'll agree with me that it's a fitting venue to discuss gender equality in architecture.
To set this in an international context, I think there are gatherings happening across the world today, looking at the role of women in society. It was interesting for me to read that the organizers of International Women's Day in the last couple of years have tried to shift from recognizing challenges to women's equality to really celebrating female achievement. And I hope we'll be able to do both in this morning's discussion. It would be remiss of us not to recognize the role that the Architects Journal have played in really spurring this debate and bringing the question of women in architecture in a British context to the fore with their issue that I think many of you will have seen, very controversial cover. It surveyed 700 women practicing in the built environment sector in the UK and raised the fact that nearly 50% of their 700 respondents thought they might be paid more if they were a man, and more than 10% said that they experienced sexual discrimination at least once a week, which are fairly shocking figures about people's perceptions of their position within the industry. What do you feel that women contribute to architecture that men don't?
It gets into that whole sort of tension and debate about, there's a difference between gender equality and whether the genders are equal. And I mean, that's certainly believed, and I feel like it's an old argument or old discussion that the genders are not, they're equal, but they're not the same. And so I really believe that women approach life and move through the city and move through the world differently. A woman walking across the space, at 2 in the morning is going to have a different experience than a man walking across the space at 2 in the morning. So as a designer, you're thinking about that and bringing that to your design, whereas a man might not.
Always coming back to this thing, and I think we're all quite stuck on, are we different as men and women? Is it dangerous to enforce that? But definitely there are masculine and feminine ways of doing things. And some men do things in a very feminine way, and some women, I think often I do things in a very masculine way. But overall, beyond the culture of the workplace, I think the culture of architectural production is one that is full of what we together think of as masculine values. We are still a heavily male practice, so out of 12 of us, 3 of us are women. But we do not want another young man with a beard in his 20s in this office. We do need to get some more voices in.
You don't always know whether it's being an impediment being female or not. Like, you're not consciously, you don't always know, you're just not consciously aware.
Something might be nature and other things might be nurture, but we grow up in very different realities. And visually, in our visual, in the design, from a design aspect in a way, like the things that we have around us, the things that we wear, the spaces that we inhabit, where we meet people, that whole language really is kind of quite different. Wherever you find your inspiration for what you produce and your architecture, if there is a difference in sort of cultural upbringing, we might as well take advantage of it.
I think that this building we're in is quite female. And that doesn't mean that when a female architect does something, it doesn't affect men, or as you say, that there aren't male and female within everybody. But I know that in my own buildings, which I do very much with my male partner, there are aspects which we both treat the same, say in how we deal with boundaries, and the confusion about boundaries, which obviously we both share. But I just realised once that all our buildings have buildings inside them, so they're all effectively pregnant, and I suspect I've done that. Not consciously, although that is also a pattern which goes back to medieval churches where you were building inside a building. So the idea of pregnancy has been around in buildings for a long time, so men have reflected it sometimes too. But I do think that women do bring their particular inner things that you almost can't define about being a woman, and those are reflected in buildings. And that's only beginning to come through as there are more women architects. And as they do it, then it affects men, but it then truly reflects society.
I have to admit that I used to be didn't want to take on women of childbearing age. I didn't not, but I sort of thought, oh golly, we'll take her on and then she'll leave. And then I stopped. We stopped behaving like that, and we just don't give a damn if there's a woman or a man of childbearing age, if you see what I mean. We have been made by law to look at people equally, and bloody well works.
Female role models for myself is hugely important. I mean, I worked at Tutor Systems with Amanda Levitt and Jan Kapiski, which was an amazing experience for me, and it was incredible to have a female boss, because for me it makes it just easier to imagine myself in that position. It might not be like that for all women, but for me really that kind of helps.
The conversation to me is very much to do with how architecture is done in Western cultures, or the response to the possibility of architecture in Western cultures. And when I first went to Ghana, and I'd been very used to, sort of like constantly coming up against obstacles in this country, and there was suddenly a situation where people said, you're an architect. God, it must have been hard in the UK. Do you want to do a master plan for us? What power stations would you like to do? And I suddenly came up against my own lack of confidence, because I'd been so used to fighting against something that when the doors suddenly opened and somebody said, oh, there you are, away you go. You've been saying you can do this for a long time. And I suddenly thought, well, I'm not really sure I can do. And so then you had to begin to build up your own confidence and find other means of support. So I think that when the doors do open, you find yourself perhaps not without the skills to do what you think you might be able to do.
You can't do architecture without making mistakes. And I think women hate making mistakes, even more than men do. I think that's just I think that's what we're like. And so it means that women don't necessarily go for broke the way that men do, because they're worried about making mistakes. On the other hand, they are fantastically good at producing very, very good architecture because they're so careful.
It also then leads into why, in some cases, we don't get paid as well, because I know for one, I'm just crap at negotiating salaries. I just don't even want to deal with that issue when it comes up. And you fall into that thing where, oh, well, you like what you're doing, so you don't need to get paid properly for it. I mean, but I really feel like that with that confidence that you're talking about would come a confidence to be able to, negotiate salaries and be taken more seriously at that, at that moment when you come in. So you set the ground.
If we are supposed to be plotting the path ahead, is one of the kind of subtitles of the event today, I wondered if all of the panelists could give us maybe up to 3 points, very specific points that you think the RABA should be advocating to change in order to improve gender equality in architecture.
There's sort of roughly nearly 50% female students of architecture, but only 20% in practice. And I think it'd be very, very interesting to know how many women who studied architecture are still doing something for which their architectural training was useful. I think that'd be more interesting to know. And I would like, if we're talking about the RABA, I would like them to be much, much more interested in what happens to people who've been trained but don't necessarily go into practice.
There's an outreach that should be happening even before university and explaining to young women what's possible.
It isn't just about solving a little bit, because there is always a bigger bit of the system that means you can't solve the little bit. And it was about that exposure from the beginning of architectural education to different modes of practice and different ways of thinking about architecture, and that includes style. And so that within the education, by the time you've come out of those 6 or 7 years, you are aware of multiple ways of working, multiple things that you might not have thought were architecture when you were sitting there filling in your careers form at 17 that actually are. Ways of thinking about how diverse voices find material form, but also inhabit buildings.
If the profession would really support young architects and young designers, then maybe you would sort of get to a stage even before you get into that sort of setting up a family. In other professions, it's a little bit easier to get somewhere when you're relatively young or get recognition.
I think the RBA needs to go out looking for women to give them a higher profile. By the time women have been dealing with, and it's often women, anybody's working part-time, by the time they've been dealing with the multifarious domestic issues, they often aren't at the exhibitions, the private views, on the panels, all the kind of things that give women that kind of broad range that Joanna was talking about. They're often at home dealing with issues that go well into when their children are teenagers, if you're an involved parent, and of course it applies to men as well. But it's really hard for women to be, I know from the small amount of panels I've been on, usually often the only woman surrounded by men who treat it like a kind of boys' club and they're all cracking jokes, they all know each other. And there needs to be more women in positions where they are being brought up as icons in architecture, not just the big names like Zaha, but you know, any one of us could be contributing well to those kind of discussions, and we're often just anonymous because we're not in a named practice, we're just not known about because we're just part-time and dealing with so many different issues.
I think it's a recognition that architects are part of the construction industry and also sit on the cusp of being a technician and an artist. And I think that's something that I've learnt recently working with artists, is just working with people who don't care whether a building stands up or not, means that you then realise what your responsibility is and yes, how important that is. And also the wide range of possibilities there are for architects.
It's a sign of a really good discussion that we have to stop short while there's still a lot more to say, as opposed to the reverse. I'd really like to thank Roca as our host for today's debate. Most importantly, to thank all of the panelists, Catherine, Joanna, Daisy, Elsie, Pernilla.